This meeting is being recorded.
Hello, everyone. Just wanted to get together again and share with you our next session in our study of Revelation. This is session 14, and it deals with Revelations chapter 6 and 7 as we continue to look at the vision that John receives from heaven. And today we're going to start looking at the opening of seven seals on the scroll. What is the scroll? Again, we talked some last time about what the scroll is. The scroll is God's message to his people. This is the actual vision that, of course, he is going to give to John. And so as the scroll is open, God's vision is revealed. And so some questions we want to ask ourselves as we get into this and look at it is the message that John's receiving. It's a message for who? And it's about what? So who's the message for and what's it really talking about? What's the purpose? And also, of course, very importantly, what's the application for us? And to do that, we're going to need to look at what does the apocalyptic language which John is using mean, whether it was specific visions exactly as they appeared that were given to him by the Lord, or whether he's using this apocalyptic language on his own to try and communicate things that he saw uh, in a language that his audience can understand. So it's very important, as we talked about before, to remember the audience. Who is the audience that John is addressing? Well, it's the first century Christians who live under the rule and cultural influence of the Roman Empire. Their faith is being challenged on a daily basis by pagan culture, idolatry, the immorality around them, and the pressure to conform that is constantly surrounding them on a daily basis. As a result, they suffer opposition. They suffer persecution at times, and some have even lost their lives for the faith. So this is the kind of environment that John's audience is living in, trying to live faithful lives in a world that is opposed to it and doesn't make it very, very easy at all. As a result, it's very challenging. As he has been doing here in this vision, John will use apocalyptic language, drawing on images from the Old Testament. Again, these images may have been directly given to him by the Lord in the vision, or he could be using them to describe something else he saw in the vision in a way that he thinks his readers would more likely understand. Either way, the message is going to be the same. But it's important to remember that he is using these images from the Old Testament, and that these are images which his readers would have been very familiar with. The images would bring to mind Old Testament settings and scenarios, thereby communicating a message relevant to the church's modern day situation. And so his readers would be familiar with the Old Testament enough, they would have been very familiar with the Old Testament text, so that whenever he used imagery from one of the Old Testament passages, it would not only be recognized as words from the Old Testament, but his readers would also be able to immediately associate that reference to the setting and the situation in which the words were originally used and which the words were originally used to address. So he would be communicating not only through the words, but he would also be implying the overall message through his reader's association with the original scenario. Hopefully that makes sense. It's kind of like if someone refers to David and Goliath, if someone referred to that story, you'd be familiar enough with that story to know not only the words of it, the details of it, but you would know that a person was also sending a message about overcoming obstacles, finding victory in a situation that doesn't look winnable, that sort of thing, because you would understand the context and the setting of the David and Goliath story enough to catch that message, even if it wasn't specifically expressed verbally. Same thing with John. There are going to be messages he's sending through his choice of references that he would expect his audience to pick up on. And so, keeping this in mind and how these Old Testament passages are going to be used as we look at it further, when examined in context and against the background of the Old Testament passages from which the language is drawn, it appears to me that the visions John describes are not trying to paint an image of events signaling the return of Christ and the end of the world. Rather, they are trying to encourage the faith of first century disciples by helping them understand their current situation. Remember how we talked about before that this idea that the book of Revelation and the visions in it are talking about the end of the world and the return of Christ is only one particular interpretation. And it's not even the one that is necessarily most common or accepted among scholars, and certainly wasn't very accepted at all among the church really until only about 200 years ago. So I believe when you look at this in context, we'll see this is not a message about the end of the world and the return of Christ, but this is again about trying to encourage the faith of first century disciples by helping them understand their current situation. So let's talk a little bit about this before we get into the details. The images arising from the opened seals. Again, I'm not going to read the text. If you need to, feel free to stop the video and read Revelation 6 and 7. Then you can come back to this discussion. But for the sake of time, I'm not going to do that. But assuming that you have looked at the text or you're familiar with it, let's talk about it. The images arising from the open seals. The images, again, are reminiscent of images from the Old Testament. Understand the setting and message of the Old Testament use and how it would have been understood by John's audience, and you will grasp a more accurate understanding of John's message. There are many Old Testament prophets and books that John will draw from. For the sake of time, I'm not going to try to hit on all of them or even several of them. I'm going to use the example of some of how he uses the book of Zechariah, as that's one that he relies on quite a bit, to kind of give you an example of how we can understand the setting of the original use of the passages and the imagery. And as a result, how that can help us understand what John is talking about in Revelation. And again, I'm going to choose some of the imagery that he pulls out of Zechariah. First of all, again, his readers, as John's listeners, would have been very familiar with the setting of Zechariah. So not only would they be recognizing the words as being from that prophet, but as they heard the imagery used and recognized them as being images from the book of Zechariah, it would also bring to mind for them the setting and purpose of the writings of Zechariah. And they would, again, associate that with, given the setting and the purpose of the book of Zechariah, what is it about our situation that is so similar that John is communicating to us in this language so that we make some kind of a association between the relevance of the setting to which Zechariah spoke versus our own contemporary situation, right? These are the kind of questions they would have asked themselves, and hence this is what would have helped them figure out what John was communicating to them. So it's important for us to understand something about the setting and the use of this imagery in Zechariah if we're going to understand what John is saying. First of all, the book of Zechariah called the people to faithfully build God's temple. They had returned from exile and they were being called to faithfully complete his temple. In chapter 1, verse 3, the Lord says, "Return to me and I will return to you." The message being laid out, and really the message of the book of Zechariah, God is faithful to his people when they turn to him. And that's a theme that we're going to see run throughout Revelation as well. God is faithful to his people, but he wants them and insists they remain faithful and turn to him. Zechariah's name actually meant the Lord remembers. And again, the Lord remembering is a huge theme throughout the book of Revelation, reassuring Christians at a difficult time that the Lord sees them, he's aware, and he cares. And if you just need to review that, go back and read those letters to the churches in chapters 2 and 3 again. Revelation, the book of Revelation is a call to remain faithful and for some to repent and turn back, similar to Zechariah. Revelation assures the church that God sees and remembers them and their plight. And this would be one of the messages that I'm sure John would want his audiences to infer from what he was writing, given the fact that he was referencing Zechariah so much. Revelation is a call to remain faithful to building the temple. Just as the book of Zechariah called on the returning exiles to build the actual physical temple in Jerusalem, so the book of Revelation is all about remaining faithful and continuing to build and strengthen the church here on earth. Well, when you look in the book of 1 Corinthians 3:16 through 17 and Ephesians 2:21 through 22, we're told that the church is the temple of God. We are now the dwelling in which God's Spirit lives and dwells. So we are now the temple here on earth. And references to Zechariah, again, no doubt would have reinforced these messages in the minds of the readers. So, for example, in Zechariah chapter 1 and 2, Zechariah speaks with an angel and has a vision in which he sees several colored horses. He is told that the horses are the ones the Lord has sent throughout the earth. They go on behalf of God to report on the state of the world in which God's people are currently living. The angel then calls out, pleading to the Lord, how long before the Lord will actually remember Israel, remember his people? The Lord answers that he has never lost sight of his people and will bless them and rebuild his temple through them. And he will judge the nations that feel secure. Those nations that by human standards have seemed so powerful and indestructible, but which God will deal with and bring low for their sins against his people. That's what's being seen and communicated in Zechariah 1 and 2. And at the beginning of chapter 2, we see the imagery of a man measuring Jerusalem to find out how wide and long it is. He's told that Jerusalem will be a city without walls because of the great number of people who live in it. God will be its protector and the glory within the city. When you go to Zechariah 6, you see an image of 4 chariots. Zechariah sees 4 chariots, each with distinctly different colored horses. They go out from standing in the presence of the Lord. It also says in Zechariah 6 that those who are far away, meaning not just Israelites, but others from Gentile nations as well, will come and build the temple. This is the promise for those who diligently obey the Lord, that is, remain faithful. That's found in Zechariah 6. And this is just kind of the tip of the iceberg. We're going to see the very similar images used here in a moment. We look at Revelation 6 and 7, as we just talked about in Zechariah. However, understand that Zechariah is just the tip of the apocalyptic iceberg. It's just one book we're referring to. But there's lots of language taken from Ezekiel, Jeremiah, Isaiah, Psalms, Haggai, and many of the other prophets that are used in the book of Revelation. And if you're going to go back and do some of your own work and some of your own study, keep in mind that you don't want to just find where these words are used, but you want to read the passages, sometimes the entire chapters around where this imagery is used in the Old Testament, so that you understand the setting and you understand what's being addressed and you understand what God is trying to communicate, because that is John is intending to communicate something very similar to his audience. And that's why he's using that kind of language. So now with that, let's take a little bit of what we've talked about and what we've seen in the book of Zechariah, for instance, and look at the vision given to John. In the vision, we're going to see horses. We're going to see 4 horses that go out from the Lord into all the earth. Well, that sounds very similar to Zechariah, doesn't it? The horses being sent out from the Lord and going out into all the earth. You have this image of the slain, martyred saints who have given their lives for the gospel. And in the vision, they will call out and ask the question, how long, O Lord, until you avenge our blood? Basically a way of saying dealing with sin. Well, again, sounds very, very similar to the angel in Zechariah crying out and asking, how long until you remember your people? And in the visions, we're going to see language of references to earthquakes, the blackened sun, a moon that turns red like blood. And these we'll see when we compare it to how this language is used in the Old Testament, and even how Jesus uses this language some, that these are references to God's judgment, and particularly judgment on nations that have opposed his people. So looking at the vision itself, the first seal, the white horse, what does the white horse mean? Some have argued that it's Jesus himself going out to conquer, being the ultimate conqueror. Others that it represents the gospel that spreads over the Roman Empire and in a sense conquers the entire world. Others have suggested it's some satanic entity, perhaps dressed in white, portrayed in white as Satan masquerading as an angel of light as he goes out to deceive and conquer people. Because each of the other writers, the other three writers, are all a negative image. And so many argue that it would be more consistent with what John's seeing if the first writer also is a negative image rather than the positive image of Jesus. Some have suggested it's another conquering force, perhaps Rome itself. When viewed through the lens of the context and what's relevant to John's audience, and comparing it to how such imagery was used and what it was meant to communicate in books like Zechariah, I would argue with a number of scholars that most likely Rome's conquest of the first century world is what's being depicted here. In other words, it's a writer. It's just showing as it did in Zechariah, the horses are meant to depict this is the state of the world. But because those writers come forth from God's scroll, and because they're called out by God's angel, that would also imply that God is ultimately in control. He is the one who is sovereign. So while the white horse likely represents Rome's conquest of the first century world, it also, the fact that God is sovereign in control, shows that Rome's power is allowed by God, and it has only been allowed because it is part of God's eternal plan. So again, it would communicate that to God's people, that just because Rome seems to have conquered and are in charge, don't worry, God is ultimately really in charge. The red horse, of course, represents violence and bloodshed, and the Roman culture was one that was born of violence through warfare and conquest, and it exalted and celebrated violence, whether that be through their pagan rituals that often involved blood sacrifices, whether it be through their blood sports, the gladiatorial games, things of that nature, whether it be through even the persecution of Christians and how their blood was often shed. Again, the state of affairs, bloodshed and violence was a way of life in the Roman Empire. Then the third seal is the black horse. Most scholars I've read agree that this represents economic hardship, inflation, shortages, famine, other things that would affect the economy. And the historical records of the day actually do show that this time in history, the late first century, was a time of great economic trouble in the Roman Empire. There was inflation, there were famines, there were shortages, and everyone in the empire, Christians and non-Christians, would have been greatly affected and challenged by this. Also, you could throw in the fact that from time to time, economic persecution was also something that plagued and troubled the church. So certainly economic hardship would have been part of the state of affairs for John's readers. Finally, the pale horse, death and Hades. Death by sword, famine, plague, wild beasts. This is language directly taken from the book of Ezekiel, chapter 5, verse 11 through 12. Again, just showing that, hey, death and hardship and bad things happen in the world. Jesus will even use these words. You can go back and examine when he's talking to his disciples about the destruction of the temple in Matthew 24, Mark 14, Luke 21. He will make an allusion to this language in Ezekiel, referring to that and answering their question as well. The image in Ezekiel is one of the Lord dealing with his people because they had turned to idolatry. Again, if you go back and you read all of Ezekiel 5, that passage, you find that's the setting. The Lord is dealing with his people because they have turned to idolatry. One of the main themes of Revelation is the call to reject Rome's idolatry and live faithfully to the Lord. And so it would be a reminder to reject idolatry and not forget destruction is born of sin. This death comes from sin and the decision to turn away from God. In each case, the horsemen come forth from the Lord's scroll and go out into the whole world, just like in Zechariah, by the command of his angel. As in Zechariah, they go out in all the world and paint an image of the state of the world. The message, God is aware, he remembers, and all falls under and within the bounds of his sovereign and eternal plan. The fifth seal, we see the souls of the slain, those who had been martyred for the faith. They cry out, how long? Just like the angel in Zechariah did. They are given white robes. They have been made holy. They are assured that sin will be dealt with in God's time. And so these words would have been an assurance to the saints who were hearing this message read, that the Lord is sovereign and their suffering and the death of the faithful ones are not in vain. So it would assure them that any suffering they were undergoing was not in vain. God was still in control. And also the loved ones they had seen martyred for the faith, not to worry because they did have an eternal reward in store. The sixth seal, God's judgment on pagan nations. And without question, Rome is predominantly in view for John's audience. But you can go to Joel 2, Haggai 2, Isaiah 34, Jeremiah 4, Hosea 10 are just a few examples, not all, but a few examples of how the language we see in Revelation is used to portray judgment on nations that have persecuted God's people. The message, God will judge the sinful. In other words, John's readers would take this to mean that Rome will answer to God. This is his way of saying that though the pagan culture around you and the powers that be seem to be in control right now, hang in there, stay faithful, because God is going to deal with them. Chapter 7 is an image of God's people ultimately living in his eternal presence. It starts out with this image of those receiving the seal of the living God. What does this mean? This is just a way of saying that none of God's people will be missed. God knows who are his, and he is going to save them from ultimate destruction. The 144,000, if you remember our talk about the use of numbers, and the reference to every tribe simply means this is a complete number. Again, all of God's people, every one of God's people. Again, Zechariah 2 made mention of the fact that many nations would come before God and be part of God's people. Every nation, again, Zechariah 6 said that even those far away, not just the Israelites, would come and build the temple of God. Again, this would be brought to mind as people are hearing the imagery that's used. And the Old Testament imagery of praise and celebration, and we also see Old Testament images of encouragement and assurance. This is all language from the Old Testament that's being used in Revelation 7 to describe the praise that God's people will give him in heaven and the assurance that God's people can live with. So finally, our takeaways. Well, first of all, God is sovereign. That's a takeaway almost every discussion, isn't it? That's because that is such an important part of the message of Revelation. God is sovereign. No matter the circumstance, he is in control. So stay faithful. Though it seems too long a wait at times, God will reward the righteous, will reward righteousness and deal with sin. In our hardest trials, God sees and remembers us. We are his. We've been sealed too, just like those disciples in the first century. We are his. We can be secure in our salvation. And again, people of all nations will be together with God for eternity. So again, it is meant to be an image of encouragement, which inspires faithfulness. Encouragement, inspiring faithfulness. So that's a real quick trip through Revelation 6 and 7. I really encourage you to go back and find some of these passages in the Old Testament, do a little bit of homework, compare the use of these images in the Old Testament with how you see them used in Revelation 6 and 7, and see what more you can learn, what more you can get out of it, keeping in mind these overall messages. Anyway, I hope you guys have a great day, and we'll look forward to our next time together talking about Revelation.